Welcome to the Rare Slot. My name is Rans, and these are the bonus episodes of the Booster Pack podcast. Now, if you don't happen to know the Booster Pack podcast, that's the show where I unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. But here on the Rare Slot, I can have a little bit more of a topic-centric, maybe casual conversation about something about the trading card game-related space or collectible card game-related space, however you want to call it. And today's episode, it's going to be a banger for two particular reasons. The first one is we have a very special guest, somebody who is perhaps one of the most accomplished and acclaimed guests that we've featured on the show to date, especially in the field of work that they do. And they are somebody who is able to provide some very unique stories and has a very unique perspective on the earliest years of collectible card games, from a certain point of view, of course. Now, the second reason this episode is going to be a banger is because it is the first time on a Rare Slot we've actually been able to follow up with a previous episode and use this episode somewhat as a companion or even a sequel to an earlier one we did. You see, if you look back on this channel or on this feed, you're going to find an episode number 5 of the Rare Slot, and that's where we talked to Joanne White. Now, Joanne is somebody who's very special in the early years of collectible card games because they founded the very first dedicated collectible card game magazine, SCRYE. Yes, on that episode, she tells us how SCRYE got founded and the interesting connections that magazine had to early Wizards of the Coast and Magic the Gathering before trading card games even launched into the world. Now, as fascinating as all that is, I would recommend going to check that out because it will provide a whole bunch of extra context for the episode we're about to do today and the conversation we're about to have. Now, you can either do that right now and go back and check it out, or you can do that at the end of the episode, and that way you can watch it as a bit of a prequel to this conversation. But it's that conversation we want to have now. And in fact, if you're still with us, it's time to introduce that aforementioned guest. Yes, our guest today is a person of many talents. They've been a magazine editor, a journalist, and are a comic book historian. But there's another talent that stands out among most of them, and that is because they can spin a damn good story. And that talent has afforded them the ability to work on some of the most loved pop culture franchises the world has ever known. That's right, at some point or another, our guest's pen has crafted tales for the worlds of Halo, Mass Effect, Battlestar Galactica, Indiana Jones, Iron Man, and even Bart Simpson. But it is, of course, their work on two of the biggest sci-fi franchises that this world has ever known that is going to have their name branded in the collective cultural consciousness. Yes, over the last 2 decades, they have written over 100 stories collectively for the Star Wars and Star Trek universes, either in prose or in comic book form, which means that they put words in the mouth of characters like Riker, Worf, Spock, Darth Vader, and perhaps most memorably, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And as fascinating as all that is, it's not the topic of conversation we're going to have today. In fact, we're going to talk about a time before they could play on the page with lightsabers and enterprises. Yes, we're going to talk about a time where gamers found magazines to be one of their most valuable resources, a time when collectible gamers were flipping through glossy pages to find deck building tips, to find other information about upcoming expansions, and of course, to find those coveted checklists and price guides that the magazines featured. Yes, enough talk. Let's deal the cards and introduce our guest. I am thrilled to welcome to the Booster Pack somebody who I consider a chronicler of comic books, a titan of tie-in novels, and an adventurer in expanded universes. It is the former SCRYE editorial director and co-author of the SCRYE collectible card game checklist and price guide, John Jackson Miller. John, how do you do, bud?
I'm glad to be here. I've wanted to be on this this podcast for a long time because I've followed your Twitter feed forever. And extra points for using enough talk deal the cards, which was my that's how I signed off all my editorials in SCRYE for the time I did it. It's wonderful that anybody remembers it. I will say that it is a curiosity for me that so many people, when they are following me for Star Wars or Star Trek or something else, or my comics history site Comicron, we'll be discussing various things and they'll mention something relating to card games, and I'll say, well, I ran SCRYE for a while, and now it's suddenly like, wait, I knew your stuff long before I knew your stuff.
Awesome. So we're going to jump into that actually, and hopefully a few more eyes will become a little bit more aware of some of the stuff you did before, Star Wars, Star Trek, and stuff like that. We're going to dive into some of the work that you did for that company, and obviously to date still have published probably the definitive checklist and guide for the collectible card game market. Even though it might be coming up to its 20th anniversary, it's still an important tome amongst the people who care like I do. Now, before we jump in headlong into the whole SCRYE thing, let's sort of wind it back a little bit. Let's learn a little bit more about your expanded universe story, in fact. Let's find out a little bit about how you gravitated towards geekdom and even gaming in general. Tell me all about that.
Well, my origin story, and kind of the fun part about this is Magic the Gathering and I really entered the story professionally at the same time, 1993. So, but before that, I was reading comics and collecting comics, age 6. Star Wars comes out when I'm 9, and I'm drawing my own comics by that point, and doing my own publications. But games were always in there for me. I mean, I was I had an older sister who had every board game in the world, and so I learned to play Monopoly professionally. I actually have made the final table at Gen Con in Monopoly, where there was nearly a table flip and violence, and we actually had to get somebody to come in and restart the game.
I mean, that's called every Monopoly game ever, though, isn't it?
Well, if you play it the right way, it should be like that. I mean, it's cutthroat. It's about slumlords battling each other. But yeah, and I was probably around the time that they say the golden age is 12. Empire Strikes Back hits when I'm 12 years old. That's really sort of my peak fandom for Star Wars and action figures and that sort of thing. Then when I'm 13, I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and this is the blue box. Actually, it's not the it's the box with the dragon on the cover, which I guess is all of them. But discovered in Walden Books, and this is one where they still had chits inside instead of the dice.
Correct.
So I mean, 8th grade, age 14 was really super cool, because that was the year that I also discovered the local comic shop, and all of the kids were into everything. So I was the president of my school's Dungeons and Dragons club in 8th grade. It was actually shut down by a group that had been alerted to us by one of the other students.
So was this like a religious motivated trouble?
Yeah, because at the time you still had on cable TV there was a preacher that was railing against Dungeons and Dragons. The whole incorrectly reported story about James Dallas Egbert III, getting lost in the steam tunnels, or in the caves rather.
Yeah.
But what happened is I got to high school, and 9th grade is when high school started in where I lived, and I'm getting on the bus, and my buddy says, I want to talk about the new comics. I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. I want to talk about everything, video games, all the stuff that had landed in, because that was the other thing that landed at the same time. Was 82 was when I got my 81 was actually when I got my Mattel Intellivision, which I consider still to be the Cadillac of the old line gaming systems. And he said, "Oh, John, we're in high school now. We're too old for that sort of thing. It's all out." And that was the case for everybody. Everybody just dropped everything. And so I said, "Well, heck, give me your comics, give me your video games cartridges, give me your D&D stuff."
That's fantastic.
And where I went as a gamer, I got most interested at that point in Avalon Hills War Games.
Yeah.
And on the card game side, Illuminati hit then.
Mm-hmm.
I was fascinated by that. I actually tried to I did some of my own game design. I did my own version of Illuminati for the presidential election of 1984. With instead, the states instead of the associations. Anyway,
that's fantastic.
So I ended up missing basically, and it's really my friend Michael Stackpole, whose name will come up a lot in this, who, he had said there had kind of been three eras of gaming to the point where he and I met. The first era was the war game era, where most of the games were produced by, companies like Avalon Hill. Most of the dealers that were selling them would be, guys in stamp shops and coin shops, and usually veterans who were, into the really hardcore military reenactment games. And then the second wave is Dungeons and Dragons, which of course comes out of chainmail and all of that. And then the third wave is kind of in the late 80s, and this is what I missed. And this is the storytelling phase, where you've got Dragonlance, you've got White Wolf coming in later on, where it's no longer totally, an independent thing, where, the game world is this thing in the background, which if you want to use all that stuff, you can. But, there's actually a storyline in there. They're actually running characters in there. And then that sort of hits its peak and goes down, and then it's Magic, which kind of begins the fourth wave. But I had missed that wave in there. And what happens in the meantime is, I go to college, I get a journalism degree. I end up going to get my master's in Soviet studies.
Right.
What's happening in gaming at that point, of course, is, as I say, sort of that storytelling wave is beginning to wind down to a degree. TSR is still the big company, and everybody is still chasing it, but it's not the healthiest company in the world by that point. And what's happening in collecting is really kind of interesting, because the company that I would end up going to work for in 1993, a company called Krause Publications up here in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, where I still live. It was founded by a collector. Chet Krause was a coin collector. He came back from World War II, started a newspaper for coin collectors on his kitchen table. And this was a magazine called Numismatic News. And it did so well that he ended up doing a magazine about old cars. And he bought magazines about sports cards. So one of the magazines that he bought was the magazine that in the 80s was really kind of keeping me going through all this period where nobody was into comics anymore. In my little group, there was a magazine called Comics Buyer's Guide. It was a weekly newspaper run by Don and Maggie Thompson, who are sort of the George and Martha Washington of comics fandom. They knew everybody. They had written the first comics fanzine in 1960. They had been to every convention ever.
Wow.
And it happened that in the early 90s, we have a couple of major events. Again, people are surprised when I talk about games or comics or anything like that, and I bring in all these other fields. The fact is, they're really related. Absolutely.
Everything sort of has that connection as far as like a cultural zeitgeist goes.
The sports card market was exploding in the late 80s. You had Home Shopping Network hustling cards. You had the big scandal with Upper Deck and the Ken Griffey Jr. cards. You had all of this stuff going on, and you had multiple licenses coming in for the sports card manufacturers, where they're instead of where it was for years, where it was Topps with the little pack of gum, cardboard cards with a stick of horrible gum,
and the gum would be stuck to the back card.
Oh, exactly. And what happened is these other companies got in there and started basically a bidding war when it came to the various gimmicks that they could put in. The cards got shiny. You got acetate cards. You get cards that were cut up from from game used equipment. The packs no longer have gum in them. And when sports cards break the buck, when sports cards no longer cost less than $1, that is the beginning of the end for many years for the sports card business. You have this shakeout, which is happening in the early 1990s, at the same time where the comics industry is exploding.
With variant covers and various different trinkets that they're putting in their gimmicks.
Which all came from advances in printing that they had done over here in sports cards.
Of course.
And the fact that some of the distributors, like Diamond Comic Distributors, they were also distributing sports cards. There were a lot of these people that were in the same space. So you had all that going on. This in the comics business, this hits its peak in the summer of 1993, when Superman died at the end of 1992 in the comics. Superman is brought back to life in April of 93. In a day that was, by my math, the biggest day in the history of comics in terms of, or not day, but the biggest month in the history of comics back since probably the 1950s, when comics cost 10 cents each and everybody had them. The problem was that the market was inflated because at that point we had 12 different distributors that were selling comics to comic shops. And what they were doing is they were battling each other, trying to open as many shops as they could. The number of comic shops explodes in the early 90s. And right as I get there, I am hired in November 1993 to become the editor of Comics Retailer Magazine, which was the trade magazine that we had started 2 years earlier. That's issue 24. 23 was my first one. Don and Maggie Thompson were editing this magazine when I got there. And they really couldn't handle it anymore because they had this, the newspaper was just burgeoning at that point with ads for hot comics and new distributors. And we were able to open the magazine because we had so many distributors, so many comics distributors that were warring with each other. Well, we had basically a real estate bubble. It burst right at the end of 1993, and everything starts to go into free fall.
So let me just interject there, because it's interesting that you say that all of these things are connected. And, you bring up the summer of 1993, which is a very important summer in sort of the analog of sort of my, field of interest, which becomes, which comes in the wave after comic books, which comes in the waves after sports cards, Magic the Gathering. So tell me, like, in this time, like when you're, trying to get through this sort of bubble of, this popped bubble of comic books, how do you feel? Do you think that the vacuum created by that helped collectible card games in some point? And what do you remember the first time hearing about Magic the Gathering was?
Absolutely. As I said, I joined Krause in November of '93, the same week that an ad salesman joined the staff. He had worked for Diamond Comics as a field rep. His name was Jim Owens. And in between Christmas and New Year's of '93, we were all hanging out at my place, and he brought Magic. He brought the Magic the Gathering cards that he had gotten, and at that point, and again, the game had been introduced at Origins, and I can't remember what order the sets came out in. Fourth edition is not out yet. I think Unlimited either is or isn't out yet. Whatever it was,
that sounds about right.
Whatever it was, we started playing this game, and for me, it was a revelation. I'm like, okay, this is the killer app.
But I bet you didn't say it like that.
Well, no, the phrase we literally used was "crack for gamers," which tells you how long ago this was. And again, not a great phrase either. But it was something where it was very clear that they had taken the collectible nature of sports cards and the randomized nature of the packs, and they had weaponized it for gaming, and basically, figured out a way to get people to buy and buy and buy. And the competitive aspect to it was still at that point One of the things that I loved about that era, and this is in part because as a gamer, I'm also a gambler, and I don't mind betting, betting a little bit now and again.
Those terms are interchangeable sometimes.
But yeah, I mean, it's gambling is enough of a thing where, back then we had the ante, the idea that you're going to cut your opponent's deck, peel a card off of it, and that card is at risk. And I'm like, wow, that's great, because that makes it basically like marbles used to be, where you have a chance of winning a valuable card from another player. And I'm like, well, we already have this wonderful system of this dynamic game where the metaverse of the game, which I think that phrase didn't come on until a little later in there, but the meta game is gonna evolve based on what new cards are infused into it. But also your local metaverse is something which is going to change. And one of the things that I liked about the ante is it was a check against the excesses that I think came on in '94 as the year went on, which is that it became an arms race between you and the other people. And if you had, as Jim eventually did, he had all the cards among the Power 9, whatever. He had those cards. It's like, okay, well, this is no fun to play anymore unless there's an ante. And if you're not going to ante, well, what's the point?
Yeah, things become degenerative. And then by 1996, we see the competitive scene take on, and they start banning cards and all that sort of stuff.
So what happens is, as I say, the Comics Retailer magazine, this is actually the second issue I edited. This is January '94 cover date, or March '94 cover date, but it was produced in January. I started doing market reports in the middle of it. And this is the first mention of Magic in this publication, a publication about comics. It's because we hadn't actually done anything where we polled people about games and that they were selling. And the retailers in this issue were saying, hey, we're selling a lot. And I'm like, you know what? They didn't hire me for my gaming knowledge, but they got it. So we go to the conventions, the retail trade shows in the summer of '94, and we try to position ourselves as the trade magazine that's going to cover this market. And there really wasn't one. There was a catalog called the Games Quarterly Catalog, which was a big sort of like Diamond Previews catalog that announced all the games as they came out, but it didn't have any editorial content. It didn't have any columns. It didn't have any retail news or anything. And I, at the same time, introduced into Comics Buyer's Guide, we had a column that I started called Table Talk, where we actually reviewed the games. The hope was that we would get people to, buy ads in the magazine for games. And also the hope was that I would get free games.
Always the ulterior motive. Now, it's also worth mentioning that as well, some of the comic book stores that were suffering at the time from that sort of boom, that pop in the comics market, sort of lent into gaming as well, especially in the trading card or collectible card game space.
Absolutely, they were saved by it, many of them. And in the summer of '94, as things were falling apart, and of course this really only works while the game is on its way up, because when we got Legends, obviously that's the peak, and the dark after that is sort of it's like taking a breath. That was the next set,
and then famously Fallen Empires after that sort of crashed the market, I guess.
And then Fallen Empires crashes the market. One retailer ordered 550 boxes, thinking he would only get 55, and he got them all, and that was it for his business.
Yeah, that's a story for another time, but yeah.
So it doesn't work very well after that. But as far as us in the magazine, we continue to add gaming content. At the end of that first year, I hire Michael Stackpole, who is a Star Wars novel author, but he worked for Flying Buffalo. And so he worked in games, and was he worked with GAMA, the trade association, and in fact was the head of the industry watch committee for GAMA. So he was the person that went out whenever there was an attack on games in the media. And at the time, they weren't after Magic yet. They were going after Vampire the Masquerade, and anything like that. And he would debunk whatever the particular attack was. But I hired him to write a monthly column about comics retailing, or rather games retailing, rather. And he did, and I learned more about that business, editing his columns than I could have expected.
Right.
I know I've mentioned this to you before online. One of the things that I needed to do in our company was I needed to say, okay, you sports card guys, this is not yours.
Yeah.
This is the way we would normally work it in this company, because we had 20 odd hobbies and magazines for all of them. We kind of had territories. This is what we cover. That's what we cover. That's what we cover. Actually, our sports magazines, they more or less helped invent fantasy baseball. It was a big deal over there. And when they saw the money coming in for Magic, they and many of the sports card dealers that were buying up the cards, they were like, they were looking at it, it's like, well, we need to actually, chase these advertisers. We need to chase this. And I'm like, are you going to do any columns about the actual gameplay? Well, no, why would we? People are just out there building sets, right? And I'm like, no, nobody builds sets. This is not that. Well, aren't they going to get their cards slabbed or graded or whatever? And it's like, well, no, nobody's going to do that either. But back then, people wanted the cards to play.
That's so interesting, because you say that, we were talking about how all these factors came in for this sort of zeitgeist of collectibles and gaming and stuff like that. And obviously it's so interesting to hear that the sports card guys immediately saw this just as a collectible thing, saw it for this value, but at the same time, it was the comic book store audience, the comic book store demographic that was leaning into the Magic cards, that was leaning into all these other franchises, Jihad and all these other, Overpower, all those other sort of collectible card games that were coming along. And obviously you had the great instinct to sort of consolidate that into your magazine, because it would get lost in amongst, like you said, cut up jerseys from, Keith and Anders or something like that back then.
We were helped by the fact that you were more likely to find a game store that was also a comic shop than you were to find a game store that was also a sports card shop. The comic shops were wanting to diversify anyway. And most of them not most of them, but many of them already had, they all carried Dragon magazine. They all had some material. And so it was, and particularly with the size of the cards, it was fairly easy for them to add. Throw a box up at the register. So, we weren't to the organized gameplay, stage or in-store gaming stage for any of this, but it was a good thing for them to lean into. But no, I mean, in that whole period throughout the 90s, basically until we bought SCRYE, I refused to allow the word collectible in anything about CCGs in the magazine. We would call them trading card games with a hyphen, the trading card being a descriptor, an adjective, meaning these are games that just happen to be trading cards and there's nothing collectible about them. And of course, obviously that wasn't true. But we ride this out there for several years. We keep looking for ways to get further into the business. We can't get the Comics Buyer's Guide readers really interested in gaming, or the advertisers interested in gaming. Probably the best thing that happened that we got out of it in the Comics magazine was that when Ice Age came out, they inserted cards in 12 different magazines.
Oh, like promo cards.
Promo cards, that's right. And we were one of them. And that resulted in the best-selling issue of Comics Buyer's Guide ever to that point. And it was 2 cards. It was, I can't remember the other one, but the one that was in every deck was the Norrit.
Little gremlin type creature.
Gremlin type creatures. And we ended up having about 5,000 more cards than we needed. And so we would keep them around the office. We used them for various things. But one of the things we would do is we would throw them at each other every so often, and we'd say "Nor it," and throw them at each other.
Exactly. You never need to buy Post-it notes again because you're just writing everything on the back of Nor it cards.
We also use them for play testing, and I guess I kind of hopped over this one bit here, which was in that glut that's starting up. Well, one of the first games in that glut is Spellfire. And Stephen Shend from TSR drove up like the week that they were putting that to press, more or less, with a set of Spellfire for us, or decks of it. And yeah, it's very clear that that game was put together in a weekend or in 72 hours. But we're still in the same state with TSR. We know TSR. They know us, and so we do columns. We did probably the first columns on Spellfire in the comics magazine, and then Stephen comes back to us the next year because it's clear that Spellfire, even though it has the D&D brand behind it, it was not invented really to be more than just something to really kind of catch the moment. And they designed Blood Wars, and Blood Wars is they send us the playtest kits for it, and we ended up using Norrit cards to actually mount all the playtest data on, or all the playtest card information on.
I shudder to think how many games have been playtested on the backs of Magic cards or vice versa or whatever. I feel like nowadays it must be almost half of the games released tested that way.
Yeah, something like that. But so yeah, we have that dynamic going on, and what happens is we don't really find anything that we can buy.
Magazine wise, you mean?
Magazine wise, or publishing wise, or book wise, and particularly that market starts to go into decline, and it goes into decline in the end of 97, because really you've just got the shakeout has happened at that point. You had way too many games. 36 games in one particular year had releases. I think the big book actually has all those numbers in it, and it was crazy, and it could not continue. 98, I think there's only like 4 new games that come out, and I think they're all part of that Wizards of the Coast thing that they did with
the Arc system and Xena and Hercules. Yeah,
Arc system. And so we're kind of looking at it, it's like, okay, well, this is winding down. And then obviously Pokemon.
Yep.
Pokemon, again, in the very beginning, the first issue of the comic book comes out to sales of like 5,000 copies in the comic shops. Nobody thinks it's anything, and it's just no big deal. That comic book would eventually sell over 1 million copies just outside the comic shops. Through 1999, it's building up. It's getting crazier and crazier, such that by the summer, I attend San Diego Comic-Con, and as I'm being delayed in the airport, as everybody was all the time, I see that there are kids in the gate area playing Pokemon on the floor, and I'm like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. We get a new publisher at Krause for the comics division named Mark Williams, who is he's I would say the best boss I've ever had, in the sense that he's basically our buffer between the people in the publishing wing of the building, where they're the bean counters, the math people, the accountants, and then us creative people who were hired to actually know something about the fields that we were in. And Mark Williams takes a meeting with Joanne White. And Joanne is at this point ready to get out of SCRYE, because SCRYE has just been incredibly hard to do. And we end up buying SCRYE and discovering how hard it is to do.
Right. And this is at the height of sort of the Pokemon boom. So SCRYE is going through sort of a resurgence, much like the industry is as well.
It's going through a resurgence, and our goal, because we were an employee-owned company, so we were trying to improve our own stock price of our own company.
Right.
And the deal was finalized and announced November 15th of '99. And what happened is the magazine showed up at the same time that all the card library showed up.
Right. And we're talking about like collectible cards, trading cards, everything, all sorts of
everything using whatever sorting system that whoever was in charge had. And sometimes there was no sorting system. It took 3 years to sort it all. It was crazy.
So these cards, just to be clear, these cards were used for like magazine reference. Like if they needed to pull an image for something, they'd go through, scan the card in and stuff like that.
Well, one of the features in our sports card magazines is they would actually bust boxes. They would bust boxes to count the number of rares. So they would obviously wind up with a lot of cards, and they had no method for getting rid of them. But anyway, that magazine, and in Joanne's interview, she talks about coming to Wisconsin to help us do the first issue, which is 7.1 in the counting. What Joanne was doing was she wanted to make it sound like a video game release schedule. So year 6 was 6.1234, 7.1234. She was only doing like 4 or 5 issues a year. And she was slowing down whenever the market slowed down and sped up whenever the market sped up. But there were a number of things that she was not doing that we knew that we did well, because we had a big infrastructure. And one of them was subscriptions. And another was we had the ability to get the magazine into a lot more newsstand locations. We had the ability to do polybags, and I'm not saying that she didn't, but we were doing these sorts of things. We had the ability to do posters and a variety of other things. And so we end up working on this magazine, and Joanne discovered that it is much different working with a company that publishes 50 magazines than it is to do one. We were not allowed to scan our cards back then. We had other office, or actually another wing, production department, that if you wanted something scanned, didn't matter what it was, you got in line.
This is to like scan something so you can put an image in the magazine itself.
In the magazine, that's all. And the rationale was, A, we're trying to streamline things. B, we don't think that most of our editors are qualified or talented enough to do this. And also at the time, the equipment was expensive. And so there was a lot of reasons why, but Joanne was looking at it and saying the same thing that we would come to say, which is, okay, we're not going to wait this long. How can we're not going to be able to do it because there's so many images in this magazine. And so one of the first things we do is Brett Frankenhoff, who's one of the associate editors, and even though he wasn't, he wasn't in the masthead a lot of the time, he proofread a lot of the stuff. Brett brought in his scanner, and we just kept a scanner hidden in the office so that we could actually do this thing. But at this point, I mean, the SCRYE was a well-oiled machine in terms of she had a whole lot of systems developed. She just had to teach us those systems. And some of the most difficult stuff that was in here is that we had all these Japanese, card. There were 48 pages of Japanese card translations that were in SCRYE every month.
Right. So let's just pause there just so people can understand the context. So essentially what you're saying is when SCRYE sort of started to pick up again, which is when Krause sort of incorporated the magazine, you guys were taking over in this time when Pokemon was booming, but at the same time, Japan was creating Pokemon and Wizards was just bringing and translating the cards. So what SCRYE started doing, and Joanne talks about this in our interview, is they started importing cards from Japan and doing their own translations ahead of time with WotC. So there's a huge business because, you know, obviously, as well as being a price guide and strategies and tips, it was also this preview for all the sets that would come out in the very near future. So at this point, you guys have to take over this huge mammoth task of translating literally hundreds of cards per set in the Japanese language into English for your magazine.
Well, what helped us was that whole section of the magazine had been done by Jack Everett and the people that he worked with. I think Jack and Joanne were married or later were. But that part of the magazine would come to us on a big disc, and we would add that. But we had plenty to work with already because we didn't know how to play any of the games.
That seems like a bit of a thorn in your side somewhere.
Yeah, little thing there. So we had three editors, outside editors that were handling various things. So we had K-Lock Fung was handling Pokemon and various connected games. Omi Dariani was handling Magic and various connected or thematically similar games. And then Jason Winter, who had worked at Decipher, was handling Star Wars and Star Trek and various thematically connected games. And and so we had everything that was being piped through them to us. But then we still had a lot of effort to go through because, I decided we would do things like, or actually, I don't know if I decided or it was a Joanne thing. It might have been a Joanne. It was a Joanne thing because I wouldn't have done this on my own because it was already very difficult. I wouldn't have done this on my own. It was already very difficult. When a Magic card that was a red card or a green card or a white card would come through, the card on first reference would get styled in that color.
The title of the card in an article, you mean?
The title of the card, and the idea was that it would make it pop for the eye. Yeah, that came from Joanne. And that it would make it pop for the eye and make people want to go find it in the back of the book, in the price guide. And so that was clever. It was also very, very hard. And because we'd see things and we would not necessarily know whether they were a card or not. And then we had the price guide. And the thing that I can say about the price guide is just that it was more advanced than any of the price guides that we were running at Krause at the time.
More so than, say, the sports cards or the coin cards or anything like that, because it was such dynamic sort of flux of the prices. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, the secret of some of these things is that, it was, there would be a dealer that would just sort of eyeball things and change things. It was very early days in terms of auctions. Certainly our coin magazines, our stamp magazines, the ones that had an actual auction house thing going on, they had real data. But everybody else, they might be collecting information from retailers, but they weren't doing what Joanne was doing. Joanne was paying people. And Joanne was paying people. She was emailing the whole price guide to retailers and saying, basically you're going to get, paid based on how many good updates you give us. And then she sets the quartile system up in the back of it, which has the low, middle, and high averages for things. And it's brilliant. And it's better than anything that we had in the building until I redesigned Comics Buyer's Guide in 2003, or 2004, where, we actually harvested eBay data. Before that, I mean, this was the best there was. And of course, this was the great thing about getting SCRYE. When Comics Buyer's Guide was going through this period in the 90s where comics was in decline, our great rival was Wizard Magazine. And Wizard was just eating everybody's lunch in terms of taking all the advertising dollars and selling all the copies. And it basically forced us into being a niche publication for nostalgia for older readers. And then they had their own magazine for games, which was Inquest. Well, Inquest was number 2 behind SCRYE. And we were absolutely thrilled to have the number 1 magazine.
Possibly because of the unique nature of Joanne's original list.
Well, one of the unspoken things that I wish we had been able to keep was she had come up with that deal for the SCRYE counter. the little miniature that was a life counter. And that was wonderful because it made the name of the magazine synonymous with collectible card gaming. And at that point, I knuckled under to the title Collectible Card Games. We changed the comics, we changed the description in Comics Retailer to Collectible Card Games.
From trading card games like you'd used before with the hyphen.
And so we started doing the magazine. And again, we found a lot of things were difficult. One of the difficult things is that nobody was going to help us. So you might notice that this is a very awful cover. It's a great cover based on what I should say the graphic designer did as good as he could, considering the fact that we didn't have any official anything for Wizards of the Coast, because Wizards of the Coast did not have approval to give us anything for Pokemon. And so we had obtained a disc with all of the images of the various Pokemon, and we just repurposed the heck out of it. And most of our covers, it was not until later that people would give us actual art. Most of the covers were either promotional material that were set by the manufacturers, or if they couldn't, we just had to make it up out of what was available. And so, we get to our biggest issue ever within 2 issues. It was so hard. That first issue, we were in the building because we bought the magazine November 15th. We were trying to get an issue out before the end of '99 so that it could be counted with the year's sales and for our company. And Joyce Greenholt who had been a gamer for a long time and had been working with our comics magazines. Joyce and I, and we were in the office nights and weekends. We learned when the security system came on and off, and we got that issue done, and it resulted in a big, the issue came out, like December 30th or something like that. Sold 165,000 copies, I think was the number, which I think is the highest it ever was, and probably the highest it ever would be.
So this is during the Pokemon sort of boom time. So obviously that's driving the magazine. Obviously people are trying to get these translations. They're trying to get the price guides. There's a lot of speculation, not just kids in the Pokemon market. There's people, teenagers, college students, game store owners buying Pokemon boxes, flipping them and stuff like that. Now tell me, as you're assimilating this magazine, taking all this work on, are you ever worried that Pokemon itself is a fad at this point and you're afraid it's going to go?
No, we realized this is going to peak, and we're going to have to make sure we pack this out, because we cannot live on Wizards of the Coast ads alone. And so we want to try to king make with some of these other games that are out there, these other licenses that are out there. And so, Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Monster Hunter, this is the 3rd issue, Digimon or Digibattle, all these things. We're just stuffing them in there. As I say, the 3rd issue is the biggest issue ever. The other thing is that Joanne had done the magazine 4 or 5 times a year. We immediately took it to 6 times, with the idea that we would go to 8 times in 2001, and then see where it went from there. It was by the middle of winter or the end of winter, it was crushing. I remember doing this one issue here where I was just at home at 3 a.m, sitting on the floor having a panic attack in the kitchen because I had been editing and restyling the names of cards and things, and it was just so hard. And what we did is we were looking to see if we could find somebody to come in and help. And we ended up hiring a very good friend of mine, James Mishler.
Right.
So what happens is, we slowly get a handle on it. They change our computer system in the middle of 2000, which makes me miserable because I just figured out everything. I just figured out how to do it on our Macs, and then they changed it to PC for no reason whatsoever, other than it was cheaper. And then, of course, they had to go right back to Max a couple of years later after that. But long story short, which is impossible now. We start finding ways to try to spin things off as quick as possible. We do a magazine bookazine basically about Pokemon,
like a special issue.
Yeah, unlicensed. Because we could sell it in bookstores because it's got an ISBN number, and we start doing that. We have at Gen Con 2000. Mike Stackpole, again, a name repeated here, he introduces me to Jordan Wiseman, who hands me the first case or one of the first cases of Mage Knight. And I look at Mage Knight, and I have the response to Mage Knight that I think people must have had to Magic at Origins, which is, this is going to change everything. Whether it's going to change everything as dramatically or not, I don't know, but I want to own this for this magazine. So we start covering it, and we start pricing it in the magazine, and we later on we change it from the Guide to Collectible Card Games to the Guide to Collectible Games, because Magic isn't, or not Magic, but Mage Knight turns out not to be the big thing that company does. It ends up being HeroClix.
So we do. Well, let's just pause for a second and just obviously catch everybody up. For those who don't know what Mage Knight or HeroClix are, for that matter, it's an entirely new genre that comes out, sort of similar to Magic did in 1993. You're talking about Jordan Wiseman, who was at WizKid Games, brings out this brand new type of collectible game, which instead of being cards is miniatures this time. So pre-painted miniatures that can be used in sort of a battle sort of setting.
But they're in randomized packs. So it's exactly like the dynamic over here. There's chase figures instead of chase cards.
And you incorporate this concept into, obviously, SCRYE Magazine and sort of onboard this entirely new genre into the magazine as well.
And so we have that going on, and once things slow down just a little, I begin to look around. Krause was a magazine publisher, but we were also a book publisher. We did most of the major price guides for some of these other fields. And I realized we had all of these price lists for all of these games that were dead. And certainly as we were going through the card packs, I realized we had all the cards for these dead games. And not all of them always, but we had samples of the what the packs look like and what the boxes look like and everything.
Of course, because you'd use them for publications, or SCRYE had used them for publications for years on end.
And I looked around in the market and saw that there was only one book that somebody had done. It was a little mass market paperback book, very small book where it was a guide to Magic and maybe other collectible card games. But it was not very thorough, and it had just, I don't even remember. I don't think I even have a copy anymore. But it made me say, we can do this big. We can do this better, and we could do this in such a way that it can destroy my Christmas.
So on top of this giant workload, after Pokemon onboards, you decide to embark on what we're talking about as the SCRYE collectible card game checklist and price guide.
Checklist and price guide. That's right. And this turns out to be, one of the things, it is the thing with regard to, SCRYE that I'm proudest of us doing, because I said, we've got a moment here. We're still early. We're still 10 years into this. We're not even 10 years into this. We're just 8 years into this when I started. I said, I can actually index every single game that ever came out. With Joyce's help and with James's help, I can actually do something where we can have a Bible that will be expanding all the time, and even though there's not going to be any traffic on a lot of these games in terms of sales, well, we can make a feature of that, because we can say, okay, here's the checklist, here's every card. And here's also, in addition to a review of the game, here's how likely you are to find the game and find other players for the game. And really what we were meaning by other players, what we were really meaning was, are you going to find this game on eBay or not? Are you going to find this in a store or not? But this allowed me to come up with basically I did the first game in the book, did a review for it. We put a review in, we put the price list in, and then I looked at it and I said, how big is this book going to have to be? And it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because this was not the kind of book where you add a listing to the middle of the phone book and everything paginates down. No, I mean, it would be a page that was designed for 7th Sea, this particular game, a page that was designed for this, a page that was designed for that game. And if you wanted to go in and add the new game that you discovered or the old game that you discovered that you didn't know existed, terror or something like that, something extremely, unusual that nobody had, then you got to reflow the whole thing. And again, it got bigger and bigger. Same thing for the photo guide that we did up front, which had all the cards in it. Every time we discovered another game, I had to sort of rearrange everything because it didn't just flow. Not with the equipment we had at the time. But yeah, it turned out to be a colossal undertaking that took every single day for something like 80 days, where I was coming in. I think I took my birthday off, but it was every single day, basically in the winter of 2000, 2001 to get this thing done. And things we discovered, first of all, reviews. You can't review a game you've never played. And we did find that there was a collector named Richard Weld, who had done his own website where he was just trying to review everything, and I think he had card lists, but he certainly had reviews. And we brought him in as a contributor, so we were able to use his reviews and use his lists, and then we went around and we just dug around for whatever materials we could find, because a lot of the stuff was in Joanne's file somewhere, where somebody had sent her a list of cards for a dead game. But some of them didn't even get into the price guide. So there are games. The one that became my sort of, white whale, my Moby Dick that I was chasing around, was I don't believe that the company that did Banemaster actually had an accurate list of its own game.
So Banemaster is a UK-made trading card game, supposedly, that just put out a ton of randoms and infamously had different card variants and all that sort of stuff as well, correct?
And yes, and I would be going through these cards. I was like, oh no, that's another one. Oh no, that's another one. And it would just get out of control. And I finally, I think the last line in that essay about that book is, we have given it our best shot.
You sort of had to do what you could do at that time.
It's just that if a company's out of business, you're not going to go anywhere with it. So, or you're not likely to get much. So, again, we in some cases, I know that the effort we put in was unnecessary. I know that the effort that we put in was just something so that we could, beat our chests and be proud and say, hey, we tried to do everything.
Well, let me just interject there, because what you did is obviously, as you and Grace and Richard and James and Jason, all of you guys put this massive effort into this particular book, this SCRYE collectible card game, checklist and price guide. And it has become basically the definitive guide of everything that sort of came out in this space and in that hobby between 1993 and there was 2 editions. There was 2001, 2003.
Yeah, the second one, which added 200 pages.
Absolutely. And as somebody who's coming on as a fan of Pokemon and eventually starts to become obsessed with the genre, it sort of acts as this great touch point for everything that happened in the times before me. And I'm sure, and I know, in fact, that it is the same for many other collectors out there. So I know you put in this overpouring of effort, but at the same time, there's always going to be people who appreciate that. And myself, on behalf of all of those people, thank you so much.
The reason that I left SCRYE in the hands of James and then Jason Winter and Joyce and James and then Jason Winter is because, having done that book, I decided I was going to do it for comics, and And that became the standard catalog of comic books.
And what's the page count on that?
This is the final edition in 2006 that we did, 1,600.
Wow. You just don't learn your lesson, do you?
Well, you know, and you know, it would have to be 2 volumes that size now because of all the variant covers. But that does tell you how big the SCRYE book could have gotten if we had wanted to go there. That does skip ahead a bit, but you know, that second year with SCRYE, I'm doing less on it because I end up getting promoted to editorial director for the comics and games division, something that didn't exist before. It was just the comics. You know, they, you know, Joyce becomes the full editor somewhere in that stretch. We do, James goes to WizKids for a while. He comes back. We have Jason Winter as well, who finally comes up to Wisconsin for a while. So we staff out, and we also have a woman named Denise Janik, who is just doing a lot of the just basic typing for the price guides, because again, that was extremely hard work, just reconciling all that information. And then a lot of the price guide work, Joyce's husband, Mike Greenholt, who has forgotten more about gaming than I will ever know. Yeah, he was working on a lot of that stuff too. So again, you know, we had a nice machine there, and we were looking constantly for what else can we do. So you know, we had those unlicensed you know, Pokemon products. We did licensed magazines for the Lord of the Rings trading card game, which allowed us to basically masquerade as a Lord of the Rings magazine on the newsstands. But you know, we're official. We're just official for the trading card game, and I can't even remember who manufactured it now. But that's the extent to which I kind of checked out at that point.
Well, I mean, I don't blame you. At that point, you know, we're starting to get into some really deep territory. And, you know, those little insert guides that they started as initially, you know, whether it was for the Decipher games like Star Wars or Star Trek, eventually, you know, you get to those full comic, you know, those full, you know, sort of book magazine sort of hybrids that you get for the bookstore channel.
And the little book magazines, and then there were little book ones that we would do. We produced some of those for the jobbers that would take old trading card games or Pokemon cards or whatever, and put them in a box that they would sell in the front of the Walmart.
Oh, right. Like a mixed bag, like a mystery pack type thing.
Well, we produced a lot of the little price guides that went in those. And so, you know, we have that dynamic going on where we're trying to make use of this stuff as much as we can, and trying to basically future-proof this company and this magazine. Again, as I said, we went from 6 issues a year to 8 issues a year to 12. And the theory was always, if things ever go downhill, we'll just, you know, we'll narrow the frequency again. We'll come out less often. Basically, the problems that develop are there from the beginning. One of the Achilles heels of SCRYE was that Joanne did a great magazine, but there just was no time left to do a website. And so there was no website that came with the magazine. I think we went out and bought SCRYEMag.com because we could never get the official URL. We weren't in much better shape in terms of having an official website. We don't have one until basically the last thing that I'm involved with relating to the magazine, and I'm no longer even, you know, I think at that point I was either editorial director for the whole collectibles group, or I was actually editorial director for the entire for the internet for the whole company at that point. One of those, I was involved with getting a website called Gaming Report, and Gaming Report was basically a you send us the news, we post it kind of thing. And so what we decided was, once again, let's not even try to start our own, because as you saw with the book, it's incredibly hard to do your own thing for the first time. But we ended up buying that website. I do regret how that transpired, because you know, our company was not able to do a lot with it at that point. You know, again, anytime you get another website or something like that, or another publishing company, you've got their systems that come in. And if their systems don't work with your systems,
It's a whole overhaul.
Yeah. So, but anyway, no, I mean, I in that stretch we get, Yu-Gi-Oh comes on, and there's a lot of positive stuff that happens. And Magic has its renaissances in there every so often. The problem though is really there was no way to tap into kind of what the next thing was for gaming, which I think, and again, I don't follow it, or didn't follow it well enough to know exactly when the breakpoints were, but obviously board gaming, casual board gaming becomes huge in the late aughts and in the early, the teens, with German and other European games, and the social gaming going on. And you have Wizards of the Coast and the role-playing games percolating as well. Again, at various times. Again, I'm not really part of it. In fact, the irony is, I had by 2000, the end of 2002, which in 2002 is really sort of the last time I have much of anything to do with SCRYE. That's when I get the offer to. Because by that point we have sold the company, so the employees no longer own the company. And I went to my boss and said, well, since I'm no longer a stockholder, I'm going to start freelancing for comics.
Oh, that's awesome.
But yeah, unfortunately with SCRYE, though, they did not, because once a private equity firm bought us and then flipped Krause Publications to yet another private equity firm within 3 years. The writing was kind of on the wall that this is, the growth period is over. I quit in 2007 to write freelance full time for comics and for novels later on. The last issue of SCRYE is this one here, which is, I guess, 131, which means we just came close. We didn't get all the way to 100 issues, but I believe this is 2009 April. And it was a shame that it happened, but the reason that it happened is they basically killed it. Instead of reducing it to bi-monthly, they decided it was worth more dead. And I think it's a bad idea. For years, the SCRYE page on my website, farawaypress.com, has gotten traffic. People looking to find out, is there another book somewhere or something? And I think it would be very, very hard to do another book. I think it would be very hard to do another magazine.
Well, everything's so accustomed online nowadays.
It is, and but I think for a while, I was flipping through that first issue and seeing the stuff that I find remarkable, that I like about it. The magazine, I never read Dragon because I was never that much into role playing. What I read was a magazine called The General, and The General was the magazine that Avalon Hill did. And the Avalon Hill magazine was very, very clubby. I mean, to the point where it actually had, club reports and reports about tournaments and, information about specific games. And that was something that was in the early SCRYEs. We had, a page of tournament results with photographs of the people. With photographs of the players, and they were tiny. I wish it was larger. I have trouble looking at it now, but I liked that. I thought, wow, this is something where this kid, when they get this magazine and they see that they maybe they didn't make any money or get a trophy necessarily for winning this particular thing at that point in time, but they've got something that they're never going to forget.
Well, yeah, and I said this to Joanne at the time. It was about building that community around the magazine, right? Which hadn't existed before. Obviously online communities exist now, but that was something that was really valuable then. Yeah,
it's so again, I'm glad that we had it for a while. I'm glad that we did it justice for a while. I'm glad that nothing we did, the editors, nothing we did killed it. I'm glad that the momentary flirtation that we had with buying Gen Con, where we actually did did have a dinner over whether we should buy Gen Con. This was in the period where after TSR has, left the scene. Well, the convention was still down in Lake Geneva. And we were like, well, should we put a bid in on this? Because we also had a division that was devoted to designing or doing conventions. And I know that we pitched for it a little bit, and then we were kind of like, oh gosh, I don't think the worst thing we could do is destroy this thing. The worst thing we could do is run it wrong. And this isn't something where, it's as easy as just running a dealer room and then also, bringing some panels off on time. This is connecting, networking, hosting hundreds of games.
Well, it's the center point of the entire industry at that point, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we've ever revealed that publicly to this point, that we were actually, whether any conversations happened, we were interested in it, and again, I don't think it would have been a good idea.
So basically, obviously from there, things in the card gaming space become living card games, deck building games and stuff all start to come out. Obviously, Scry starts to go away eventually as these sort of things start rising. The internet starts to sort of evolve into the way that we sort of know it today, and sort of in more familiar fashions like social media and stuff. The room for, card game magazines, price lists with things like eBay sort of starts to fall away. And, obviously Scry starts to deteriorate as, you guys are stepping away from it. So I do have a couple of last questions to sort of wrap us up here, and just get an idea after you sort of step away post sort of the guide and everything like that. And they're very broad, just very general questions, just very silly questions as well, just that might interest, somebody who has been reading, your work for nearly 20 plus years now. And somebody who's just been curious about, as a guide or a person whose name is on the cover of a book I refer to almost daily at this point. Was there ever a franchise or an IP in the collectible game space that never came out as a collectible game that you personally thought would have made a great collectible card game?
Die Hard.
Really? Die Hard?
Oh yeah, because it's a two-handed game. And at that point there had been 3 movies. There was about to be 4. And I've always wanted to do the Die Hard comic book as well. And it was a novel. It started as a novel before it was a novel before it was a movie, which is not something that's well known. But yeah, I mean it's got to be a two-handed game. I know other franchises where I know one company, a friend of mine was working with them to maybe do something for Blair Witch, which tells you what time this was, the Blair Witch Project. There are a lot of things where you just sort of look at it and you say, well, what's the angle here? How do you keep somebody into this forever? How do you, and obviously, something like Die Hard, you just move it from space to space to space. It's not a building this time; it's an airplane. It's not an airplane this time; it's something else. And the setting evolves, whatever. But yeah, I've always thought there were things that could have been done like that.
Die Hard, that's hilarious. Now, the other question I guess I have, you write now, you've moved away from gaming completely. Is there any, and you've written for some of the biggest franchises ever. We mentioned a bunch in the intro. People watching on YouTube will be able to see a myriad of different titles behind you that you had your hand in. Is there a particular IP that you've always dreamt about writing for that you haven't particularly dived into yet for our question to go out on?
The one that I want is never going to happen unless I buy the rights myself.
And what's that?
I'm a huge fan of the Max Headroom TV show from the 80s. And anybody who follows me, and this allows me to segue into my Twitter, everyone who follows my social media feeds knows that I'm obsessed with old television and the idea of warring networks that control everything. That's kind of fun. And again, it was set in the future, but it was only set 20 minutes into the future. So it's a fairly old IP. It never had any games. It never had any comics, surprisingly, and certainly no novels. But that would be fun. But you know, I get those occasionally. I mean, I wrote the 40th anniversary graphic novel for Battlestar Galactica. And you know, for me, that was just completing the kid trifecta, the stuff that was out when I was 11.
Well, obviously, you know, who knows when the next reboot is around the corner. And in this era of like regurgitations and everything, Max Headroom could be a VR simulation or something like that in the next incarnation. And who knows who goes back to it. So I can't wait. And you sort of mentioned it in there, your Twitter feed. Tell us about it, where people can find you online and everything like that.
Yeah, all right. People can find me, you know, my fiction and comics and trivia, you know, TV trivia stuff. That's all on Twitter, JJM Faraway. I am on Facebook, John Jackson Miller. I am on Instagram, John Jackson Miller. My website is farawaypress.com, where I've got behind the scenes notes on just about everything I've done, including those gaming products. This is all of this in the nonfiction section. I also have essays about SCRYE there in the nonfiction section. Then the other project I have is Comicron, COMICHRON.com, which continues the work in that giant book of, you know, keeping track of the number of comics in circulation. And so I've had the sales charts going back all the way back to the 60s that are on that website. And that has its own Twitter Comicron, Facebook Comicron, and actually it's also got a Patreon, Comicron, COMICHRON.
Okay, awesome. Well, all of that will be linked in the description. And I have to say, as somebody who's an aspiring pop culture historian, gaming historian, the work that you do is incredibly inspiring for somebody like me, looking at all the stuff that you've preserved, looking at all the information that you make available. If only I had the time, I would love to be able to do the things on your level, and that's very aspirational for me. So thank you so much for joining me today, John. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk about SCRYE Magazine, your origins, and everything else in between. Goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, bud.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And definitely everybody follow your Twitter there, because I do. And you're doing a lot of the stuff that I would have done if I had time and had the technology. So
thank you so much. When I get time, I definitely try and update that Twitter and try to talk about the collectible card game thing. But again, same to you. Check the links in the description. John Jackson Miller's, all the stuff we just mentioned will be found there, and so much more as well. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, our second installment in the SCRYE saga with John Jackson Miller. By all means, please check out the websites that he mentioned. They're all going to be listed in the description, because he does some fantastic work online. You know, he talks about classic TV, he talks about comic books, he talks about the work he does with Star Wars, Star Trek, and even more franchises. And sometimes, just sometimes, he talks about SCRYE Magazine as well on there. So again, that's all linked in the description. And thank you so much to John for joining us today. And thank you guys for listening to this episode. Now, as for me, I've been Rance, and I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe to this channel wherever you've heard that, whether that's a podcast feed, grab it in the catcher that you get it, so you get updates when we get new episodes, or on YouTube, subscribe, hit the bell, all that sort of stuff. Or jump over to social media. That's where you can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/CCGHistory, or twitter.com/CCGHistory, or at CCGHistory on either of those if you want to tag me, or you can send me a DM on any of those platforms as well. There's also our email address if you want to send me something a little bit more long form or some direct feedback or something in that regard. That is theboosterpack@ccghistory.com. And lastly, we also have a listener survey, all of which you can find in the description. You can find obviously links to the social media, you can find links to the email address, and of course you can find links to where you can find me as well elsewhere. All right, that's about it from me. Thank you again for joining me for this very special episode of the Rare Slot. I can't wait to see if we even get a third episode maybe in the SCRYE saga somewhere down the line. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. I've said it once in this episode. I'll say it again. Enough talk. Deal the cards.